scream, heavy in the streets.
We gon' get it, we gon' get it, we gon' get it. We gon' get it, we gon' get it. Get it in blood. Get it in blood. We gon' get it, we gon' get it, we gon' get it. We gon' get it, we gon' get it. Get it in blood. Get it in blood.
Good rich.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Saints and Appetizers podcast. And we're coming at you with some appetizers. It's been almost a month now since the last UFC pay-per-view, UFC 288. 288 was the last pay-per-view, and before that, and before this being like a month away, I was. I don't know if you say it's complaining, but I was noting that a lot of the pay-per-views were only 2-3 weeks out and apart from each other. But finally, they kind of got back onto their normal schedule and had this one a month down the road. But yeah, we got some appetizers for you. We got a UFC 289 prediction show, and that is a UFC 289 Nunes versus Aldana, and that is June 10th, Saturday, June 10th, 2023, the Rogers Arena, Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. So this is in Canada, and that's the card. We're going to be going over the main card here. We go through the main card and give you some of my picks and some of my thoughts of this event that's coming up. And just initial thoughts on this card is that it's, I say this a lot. I say this, it seems like I say this every time, that this is not that great a looking card. There aren't like a lot of exciting name or marquee names on the card. And then it ends up being a great card. And then you get a card where it's like 2-3 title fights on it, and every fighter on the card is a superstar, and then it ends up being a dud. But just from initial temperature gauge of this card, it's not really overly exciting. It's only got one title bout on it, and it's a women's title bout. And everyone knows Amanda Nunes is pretty much the king, queen, whatever you want to call her, of women's mixed martial arts. And then the other fight, I guess it doesn't have that tag connected to it, that it's a lightweight title fight contender, like eliminator, that whoever wins that fight between Charles Oliveira and Beneil Dariush will end up being the champ, or will get a shot at the champ, which would be what is that? Islam Makhachev. That's who beat? Pretty sure that's who beat. Yeah, that's who beat Charles Oliveira back on October 22nd, 2022. Arm triangle choke submission. The belt was vacant, but it wasn't a title fight for Charles Oliveira, because he didn't make weight for the fight. Or maybe he made weight for this fight, but the prior fight against Justin Gaethje is where he had to give up his belt and still fought with only Justin Gaethje having a chance to win the belt. He actually made weight, and it was for a vacant belt that he had vacated himself because he couldn't make weight for that fight. But anyways, let's get into this card with the main card here. All the fights on the main card. So let's get into the first fight here. We've rambled on enough about stuff we'll dig deeper into here in a moment. So anyway, can I get a menu? And first thing on the main card is a middleweight bout. First fight is a middleweight bout. between Marc-Andre Barriault versus Eric Anders. And my initial thoughts of this fight is just seeing the names Marc-Andre Barriault and Eric Anders is I've heard the name Eric Anders before. I think I've seen him fight several times, and like my initial want is to probably pick him to win the fight. But you know, you kind of got to look at people's past history and things like that before you make a decision. Just because the name is notable and recognizable doesn't mean that's exactly who you should pick, because he's had a little bit of a rough go of things in his last 6 fights. He's he's 2-3-1, with the one being the no contest, and he's lost one of those by submission armbar, and 2 were by decision, and the no contest was against Darren Stewart, where it was a legal knee to the head, a down opponent. So that's where the no contest come from. And he did win his last fight because he was on a 2-fight losing streak. He did win his last fight against Kyle Dukakis, and that was a TKO by punches victory, and that was December 3rd, 2023. But his overall record is 23. He has 23 fights, 15 wins, and 7 losses, and 9 wins by knockout, 1 win by submission, 5 by decision, and then he has 7 losses with 1 knockout, one by knockout, 1 by submission, and 5 by decision, and then obviously no contest that we just talked about. So, you know, just looking at the records and having seen him fight a few times, he's a fighter that's going to want to stand up and fight, I'm sure. And he's showed that he's durable, because in these 23 fights, and even though he has the 7 losses, he's only been finished twice. But on to the Marc-Andre Barriault. His name was not quite as familiar. Seems as if he's had a little bit better luck in his last 6 fights, because he's 4-2 in his 6 fights, and he has a very similar overall record with 22 fights, with 15 wins and 6 losses, and he has a no contest on his record as well. It goes back all the way to 2020. And that was overturned to a no contest. Originally a TKO win by him, which was overturned because he must have failed a drug test for some PEDs. But that was before his last 6 fights. So that would have been 7 fights back. And so he has just as many fights, 22 matches, 15 wins, 6 losses, and 10 of those wins come by knockout, 1 by submission, and 1 by decision. And then the losses are very similar. You know, he's only been knocked out once, he's only been submitted once, and then he has the 4 decisions. But he shows that he's more durable, I would say, because or very similar records. Not that he's more durable, because they've both only been finished twice, but showing that he's out of his 15 wins, 10 of them, double-digit wins, have come by knockout. Shows me, just like Eric Anders, he's more of a fighter that wants to stand and throw and try to get the knockout. And just because I'm just kind of go off of history and winning history, that Marc-Andre Barriault has been a little more successful over his last 6 fights, and he has 10 knockouts. But I'm going to go with the fact that neither of them have been finished a lot in their career either, and both of them are stand-up fighters. I think I'm going to go in this middleweight bout between Marc-Andre Barriault and Eric Anders. I think I'm going to go with Marc-Andre Barriault. I think he's going to get the knockout, or not the knockout, but I think this is probably because these are both two durable guys that like to stand and bang. I think this will be a fight that actually just goes to decision. So in the first bout on the main card, UFC 289, the middleweight bout between Marc-Andre Barriault versus Eric Anders, I have Marc-Andre Barriault winning by decision. All right. So on to the second bout on this card is a featherweight fight between Dan Ige and Nate Landwehr. And similar to the first fight on the card, one of these fighters' names really sticks out to me and is memorable and is a name that I identify when I see it, and that would be Dan Ige. I'm pretty sure I've seen his name. I've watched some of his fights, and his name is just a little more recognizable than Nate Landwehr, probably the more famous, more notable fighter. But he's similar to Eric Anders. Has had a little bit of a rough go over his last 6 fights as well. He is just 2-4 in his last 6 fights, and all the losses came by decision, and the 2 wins, which are separated by 3 fights, 3 losses, or both KOs, with his last fight being a KO by punch versus Damon Jackson. That was January 14th, 2023. And similar, it's kind of funny that I keep going over the records of these fighters, and they all seem to be same amount of fights, same amount of veteran fights. You know, they've had a decent amount of fights. You know, so once again, he's had 22 fights on his career with 16 wins and 6 losses. And in those 16 wins, he had 5 knockouts, 5 submissions, and 6 decisions. And then in the losses, he's had 0 knockouts, 0 submission, and 6 by decision. So it shows he's very durable, and the fact that he has almost across the board, 5 knockouts, 5 submissions, 6 decisions, when it shows me he's very well-rounded, that he can beat you standing up, he can submit you, and he has the stamina and the durability to go the distance with people. That's pretty prevalent when you see that he's never been knocked out and he's never been submitted before. And then Nate Landwehr, name that's not quite as familiar to me. He has been more successful though in his last 6 fights. He's 4-2 in his last 6 fights, and is on a 3-fight winning streak on top of that. And he has not 22 fights, but 21 total fights in his career. 17 wins, only 4 losses, 8 by knockout, wins by knockout, 2 by submission, and 7 by decision, and then 2 losses by knockout, 1 by submission, 1 by decision. And seems like he's had a little more success over the last 6 fights, especially the last 3 fights, which he's on a winning streak. 2 of them have come by submission. But just because of the fact that Dan Ige has never been stopped, never been knocked out, never been submitted, I think I'm going to go with Nate Landwehr to win this by decision. So on the second bout of the main card, UFC 289, the featherweight bout between Dan Ige versus Nate Landwehr, I'm going to go with Nate Landwehr to win another decision. First 2 fights, I believe, are going to go to decision. All right. The third fight on on the main card, we have a welterweight bout between Mike Malott and Adam Fugit. Mike Malott, he's another fighter, kind of like um, Nate Landwehr. He's on a little bit of a winning streak here. He's four, 5-0-1 in his last 6 fights. So the one being the 6th fight he's on a 5-fight winning streak, and the one being a draw, which was all the way back on September 15, 2015, was a draw. That was a majority draw. Usman Thomas Deegan was the opponent, and that wasn't even in the UFC yet. He's only had 3 fights in the UFC if you can include the Dana White Contender Series. So he's 3-0, and he's on a 5-fight winning streak, but and then 3-0 so far in the UFC, and he hasn't had a lot of fights. He's a pretty not that seasoned of a fighter, not a veteran fighter. Doesn't have as much training yet, I guess, because he's been fighting for a while, since 2011, but still has only had 11 fights, so he doesn't have as much training and stuff. But let's see. So in the 11 fights, he has 9 wins and 1 loss. So he only has 11 fights, so he doesn't have a ton of experience. But I don't think Adam Fugit has much either. Has much more either. So in the 11 fights, he has 4 wins, 9 wins, 4 by knockout, 5 by submission, and one loss, and that was he got knocked out, and then he has the 1 draw. And in the 3 fights in the UFC, 2 of them came by submission and 1 by knockout. So he showed that he has some well-rounded ability and has some finishing ability, because he was the performance of the night in his last fight back on February 25th, 2023. But similar to him, Adam Fugit has been in just 12 fights, so his experience level is not much greater, but he's been successful, similar to Malott. He's won the majority of his last 6 fights, because he's 5-1 in his last 6 fights. And in those 6 fights, this will be his 3rd fight in the UFC. And in just the 2 fights in the UFC, he's won his last fight by TKO elbows, and then he actually lost the fight back on July 30th, 2022. He got knocked out by Michael Morales. And then the 4 fights previous to that were all by finishes as well, like TKO punches, TKO elbows, submission, rear naked choke, submission, Kimura, but those were all outside the UFC. But in his last 6 fights, all of them have come by way of finish, even the fight that he lost. So he's very well rounded. So in his 9 wins, he has 5 wins by knockout, TKO, and submission, 3 wins by submission, and 1 by decision. And in the 3 losses, he's been knocked out, TKO'd twice, no submissions, and 1 decision. So he's definitely a rare-rounded and relatively durable fighter as well. But he definitely has 2 more losses than Mollet. But these first 3 fights, all these fighters are very similar, have very similar records. I think Adam Fugit has been knocked out twice in his career, and less than a year ago was knocked out by Michael Morales in July. And Mike Mollet has some KOs on his record, 4 of them, and 2 in the last 6 fights. So in this welterweight bout, the 3rd fight on the card between welterweight fighters, Mike Mollet and Adam Fugit. Even though I think Fugit, he's probably more of a ground submission specialist, but has a couple knockouts on his record, and I think I'd say Adam Fugit is maybe more of a stand-up fighter, striker, because he has 5 knockouts to 3 submissions. But I think I'm going to go with Mike Mollet in this fight versus Adam Fugit to get the knockout, to add another knockout to his record, went to the win column. So in the welterweight bout between Mike Mollet versus Adam Fugit, I got Mike Mollet by knockout TKO finish. All right, what we're here for, the co-main event and the main event. And in the co-main event, it's a lightweight bout between Charles Oliveira versus Beneil Dariush. And I think originally Beneil Dariush was supposed to fight. He was supposed to fight Islam Makhachev. I'm trying to remember if that was before he had the belt or after he had the belt. But I think what stopped that from happening was the fact that Beneil Dariush broke his foot and was out for like a year and a half. So I think that must have been, he was out for a year and a half. That must have been before he was supposed to fight Islam Makhachev, once he had won the vacant belt from who he's facing on Saturday night, Charles Oliveira. Because Charles Oliveira, before the fight against Islam Makhachev, he was on a 11-fight winning streak before he got rocked and just kind of crumbled to his back and pretty much just accepted getting submitted by arm triangle choke. And that was for the vacant belt that he had originally had to vanquish versus Justin Gaethje because he didn't, and that was at UFC 274 where he didn't make weight. But then he was trying to win his vacant title back where he did make weight, but just didn't look ready in the fight against Islam Makhachev. Just got outclassed standing and on the ground. But he is a fighter that's dealt with adversity and had long winning streaks because he has 43 fights with 33 wins, 9 losses, and 1 no contest. In those 33 wins, he has 9 by knockout, 21 by submission, and I think he has the record for most submissions in the UFC, 3 by decision, 9 losses, 4 by knockout, 4 by submission, and 1 by decision, with his last loss and last fight, coming by way of submission, where he just looked completely outclassed and dominated by Islam Makhachev, which is hard to say considering how dominant Charles Oliveira has looked at times when knocking off fighters such as Justin Gaethje, Dustin Poirier, Michael Chandler, Tony Ferguson, Kevin Lee. Those are just some of the guys that he just pretty much dominated, ran through during his 11 fight winning streak. And contradictorily, about that is that Beneil Dariush is on a decent winning streak himself. Is on an 8-fight winning streak. So it'd be interesting on the flip side of Charles Oliveira having a long win streak just recently getting snapped. It'd be interesting to see if Charles Oliveira ends up turning around and snapping Beneil Dariush's winning streak. And Beneil Dariush has been in 27 fights, 22 wins with 4 losses and 1 draw. In the 22 wins, he has 5 wins by knockout, 8 by submission, 9 by decision, 3 in the 4 losses. He has 3 by knockout, 1 by submission. So both these fighters, Beneil Dariush and Charles Oliveira, are very experienced, well-rounded fighters that can beat you standing up, can beat you on the ground, or can go the distance decision. But in this lightweight bout between Charles Oliveira versus Beneil Dariush, which could be a lightweight title eliminator fight, so whoever wins this could be up to fight Islam Makhachev for the lightweight belt. But in this fight, lightweight bout between Charles Oliveira versus Beneil Dariush, I think I'm going to go with Charles Oliveira to get back on track. And I think he's going to extend that record of submissions in the UFC, and I think he's going to submit Beneil Dariush. I know Beneil Dariush has been in 27 plus fights and has only been submitted once, but I think Charles Oliveira might get him again, might get him with that signature rear naked choke. So in the lightweight bout between Charles Oliveira versus Beneil Dariush, I have Charles Oliveira winning by submission. All right, on to the main event. The main event was a women's bantamweight bout between Amanda Nunes versus Irene Aldana, and I believe kind of like the Beneil Dariush fight. He was more scheduled to fight Islam Makhachev, but that kind of got thrown off due to injuries. I believe that this was supposed to be the trilogy fight between Juliana Pena, because they had fought. Amanda Nunes has fought her in her last 2 fights. The first one being at UFC 269 back on December 11th, 2021. And that was a fight where Amanda Nunes actually lost her belt, just looked out of shape and just looked gassed and pretty much just gave up her back in the rear naked choke. And it came out later, of course, it comes out later that she had a knee injury and wasn't able to train fully in camp. And then they had the rematch at UFC 277 on July 30th, 2022. And Amanda Nunes basically just kind of ran through her to regain the belt. And she's a champ. Amanda Nunes is champ because she has both the bantamweight and the featherweight belt. So has the belt at 135 and 145. But it seems like she's kind of holding up the division, the featherweight division, a little bit. This is kind of just some of my thoughts on this, because I know there's not the talent pool for the women's featherweight division isn't great, but she hasn't defended that belt since she fought Megan Anderson and beat her by reverse triangle armbar at UFC 259. March 6, 2021. So and that was in the first round. So it's amazing that there's these fighters that are like champs and all that, but kind of like Conor McGregor when he had the two belts, like he never defended his belt and he was just kind of holding up divisions. That kind of seems similar to this because that's already been more than 2 years ago since she defended her belt at 145. But in her last 6 fights, she's 5-1. Obviously, the one just being Julia Pena, and standing in for her for Julia Pena is Irene Aldana, and that's who she's going to fight instead of Pena, the trilogy fight. I guess that'll be down the road depending on the outcome of this fight. But uh, Amanda Nunes has had 27 fights in her career with 22 wins and 5 losses. 13 of those wins came by knockout, 4 by decision or submission, and 5 by decision. And then the 5 losses had 2 losses by knockout, 2 by submission, and 1 by decision. So she's well-rounded as well, but when it comes to women's MMA, she's about as knockout artist and as dangerous of a striker as you can get. So, Irene Aldana, this is definitely a tough task for you, girl. And she's been on a decent won a decent amount of her last 6 fights as well. She's 4-6 in her last 4-2 in her last 6 fights, and on a 2-fight winning streak with both the last 2 fights. She won both of them by knockout. Macy Chasson was an up kick, like an up kick KO body kick, which was a crazy way to win that fight. That was at UFC 279, September 10th, 2022. And then Yana Kunskaya was a TKO. TKO punches at UFC 264, July 10th, 2021. So some of those fights a lot of her fights are spread out by a year at a time. She only has about 1 fight a year. Look at her recent history. And she has 20 fights with 14 wins and 6 losses. In those 14 wins, she's had 8 wins by knockout, 3 by submission, 3 by decision, 2. And in the 6 losses, she has 2 knockouts, been knocked out twice, has never been submitted, and has 4 losses by decision. So she's shown that she's a relatively rounded fighter, but I would say with the 8 knockouts that she has and the fact that she's gotten knockouts in a good, like 3 of her last 4 fights, she's won by knockout. So I'd say that she's more of a striker, more of a fighter that rather keep it standing than trying to take someone to the ground and trying to submit them. But this is a tall task for her, fighting such a great champion and like Amanda Nunes, and one that got refocused and re-motivated once she lost the belt to Julia Pena. And if she's healthy, she can beat any woman in the world at those 2 weight classes at 135 and 145 if there's ever any challengers. But in this women's bantamweight title bout with Amanda Nunes, the champion, versus Irene Aldana, I'm going with Amanda Nunes to retain her belt, retain the women's bantamweight belt. And I think she's going to knock Irene Aldana out. I mean, Aldana, she's tough. She knocks people out, but she's been knocked out a couple times too. And I just don't feel that she's on the same level as Amanda Nunes. So for the UFC 284 Nunes versus Aldana prediction show, just go through these one more time. We have middleweight bout between Marc-Andre Barriault versus Eric Anders, and I got Marc-Andre Barriault to win by decision. And then in the featherweight bout between Dan Ige versus Nate Landwehr. I have Nate Landwehr winning by decision, so 2 decisions there. In the third bout, welterweight, in the third bout, the welterweight bout between Mark Malott versus Adam Fugit, I got Mike Malott getting the win by knockout. And then in the co-main event, lightweight bout, easily could be a title eliminator bout between Charles Oliveira versus Bamel Dariush. I got Charles Oliveira adding to his submission record, win record. And then in the main event, women's bantamweight title fight between Amanda Nunes, the champion, versus Irene Aldana. I got Amanda Nunes knocking Irene Aldana out. So there you have it. There's my picks. Let's hope I do better than I've done in the past couple events. Hopefully we can get more than 2 of these right. Let's try to get over 500 this time. But anyways, I think that's all I have for you. So can I get a check, please?